20s. It's a progressive, forward-leaning nation, even though they're going through very difficult times right now. I think it's how we relate to each country each day. It's not whether or not we stand by Israel or not that really equate to whether or not we have influence and we can be a positive force in the Middle East. Because these nations like the United Arab Emirates or Jordan would not be with us if we were characterized by one thing. And let me just point out, when I was last in Jordan, their king told me that as far as Afghanistan goes, he said Jordanian soldiers will stand beside you in Afghanistan until the last American soldier leaves. That is not something you get if our foreign policy is summed up by any one issue. That's a much broader statement about people's belief in the country that you and I were blessed to be born into.
Since you brought up Bahrain, we would note that they've had their political troubles too in the past 2 years, a Sunni versus Shia contest over representation. So Susan Wells of Agricultural Economics and Natural Resources asks, well, she puts Bahrain along with several other countries. She says political changes or unrest in Egypt, Bahrain, and Iran all pose challenges for U.S. naval forces. When you consider the vulnerabilities of the Suez Canal and the Persian Gulf and U.S. operations in both, where do you see the greatest cause for concern? Egypt, Bahrain, Iran?
Every morning I wake up, ladies and gentlemen, and I have 3 focus areas: Iran, Iran, and Iran. Susan, the point I would make is you pick out some very key countries. Egypt, how Egypt goes in the Arab awakening will probably have a lot to do with how the whole region goes. As you saw, the American military had very close relations with the Egyptian military over 20 years. They're officers in our schools. We exercise together. Unlike Libya, unlike Syria, the Egyptian military did not take political sides. It wasn't perfect. For those of us old enough to remember when our military was put into certain places like Kent State University, we weren't good policemen all the time either. But the bottom line is they protected a political process that brought in a Muslim brother-dominated legislature and a Muslim brother president. I bring this up because there was no love lost between the Egyptian military and the Muslim Brotherhood. So as we watch the kind of relations we have in these countries, our military relations at times are fundamental to seeing political reform at each country's own pace and in each country's own way. If Egypt goes with the traditional Egyptian character, we'll be fine with the Suez Canal. And I was there last week talking to the new Egyptian military leaders, and they are absolutely committed to a close relationship with us. Iran, on the other hand, has got Lebanese Hezbollah in Lebanon. Basically, how would you like it if there was an armed gang in your own state that decided when they might commit war on Canada, when they might not? That's basically what Iran has with Lebanese Hezbollah in Lebanon, where the Lebanese military is second in power to that Iranian militia. You see Iran helping right now to keep Assad in power, and the savagery grows worse. I was up on the border talking to refugees in Jordan here just a couple weeks ago, talking to these women who've come out of a place where they had a home. They now have nothing but the clothes on their back. They've buried some of their children, and this is in large measure due after Russia's regrettable veto in the United Nations. This is largely due to Iran's reinforcement supplies and a very capable general that they have put into Damascus. Down in Yemen, you find the same thing where a democratically elected president, the first in 30 years, is trying to put his country back together. Meanwhile, Iran helps both Al-Qaeda, a Sunni terrorist organization, unusual for a Shia state, and they are also helping the Houthis rebellion there by bringing in guns, ammunition, that sort of thing. Everywhere I go, I see the same thing about what Iran is up to. And ladies and gentlemen, yes, they really did try to murder the ambassador of Saudi Arabia in Washington, D.C. a year ago. They were really that stupid. Iran knew that at the highest levels and tried to do that. They've been arrested in Thailand. They've been arrested. They murdered a Saudi diplomat in Karachi, Pakistan, had been arrested in Africa. Iran is right now acting as a rogue state, and it is a deep concern to me. So that would be my bigger concern, the Gulf, the waters there. But I tell you, Susan, if you're looking for work, just the fact that you're asking that question, I'd be happy to hire you on as part of my intelligence staff.
This leads nicely into Caitlin Glover's question. She's from Agricultural Communications. We've seen a number of volatile regimes fall in the Middle East recently, while others show instability. What do you think is the best approach for promoting stability after regimes are toppled or fall?
Well, I think that when the regimes have fallen, I can't give a better example perhaps than Yemen, that 2 years ago everybody thought was a basket case, and now actually has a chance for progress. You look at Egypt, and I think the jury's out there facing terrible financial situations. But in both cases, the most heartening cases, it had to do with an election and people feeling like they had some control over who would be their leadership. That does not solve all the problems. That does not give you sound monetary policy. It does not create jobs. That's the hard work of government. But what happened in those two cases was the opposition in both cases was now put into power. It's a lot easier, those organizations are finding, to be against something than it is the government. I think what we have to do is we support democratic processes where we can do so, and then we support them with the international monetary, the international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, and we try to get them back on their feet so that people don't feel like they have to immigrate or they don't have to take up guns. There's actually jobs, there's a future for them. So I go with both a democratic process and then a governance support, primarily how they get their financial act together as the most stabilizing approach.
So this brings up an interesting problem, of course. So this is a question from Kathleen Buzis, and I'll add a little bit to it. She's a global and area studies major. Some Middle Eastern states have elected groups that we might think of as extremists to political leadership. Examples like Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Hamas among the Palestinians, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or even if we go back to the 79 revolution in Iran, that too was an elected government. What can the U.S. do to encourage political moderates within the region?
Well, that's going to be a very tough one. I think part of it has got to be where we try to maintain them as part of the community of nations that's open. It runs an open society, that the United Nations can be there and help them in a number of ways to help jumpstart what they're trying to put together. But right now, the Middle East is going through difficult times. I think that where we can encourage, for example, in Egypt, that they stay consistent with the Egyptian character, the traditional Egyptian character, that in itself is a bulwark against extremism. But when they get into a position where the extremists are starting to win, you have to recognize that terrorism is terrorism. And in those cases, what we have to do is work with their forces and maintain between anti-terrorism skills. You know what those are, you see them on TV shows and stuff like that. Those who've been veterans have seen arguments with it, but also ethical training so that you don't give military skills, police skills to people who are going to use it simply to install the next autocrat. We've got to be very, very careful how we live by our values. But at the same time, we've got to marry our time. And that means we've got to recognize that if the terrorists are starting to get traction, you have got to help the people who are fighting against them. That upsets some people. I'm sure it upset some people in Wyoming in 1942 when FDR, a very progressive president, made common cause with a guy named Stalin who murdered millions of his people to defeat Hitler. There are tough decisions to be made. Fortunately, today, we're not in that situation. The people we work with, they may not be perfect, but they are open to our ideas on a military level, for example, on educational levels. We have very good educational relations with many of these countries in that part of the world. And if we work with them and we try to keep them reinforced for their better angels and not fall backwards into a more medieval response to those the elements they didn't like before and are now in power, I think we can find our way forward. It'll be a dialectic process. It will not be perfect, and at times it will frustrate you. But I worked in the real world, not in the ideal world.
So maybe you'll be able to go to a really specific example of that. This is a question that's sort of a combination from Jared Unace, who's in biology, chemistry, and international studies, and Chad Gibbs, who's in history. And this is about Afghanistan and the not-so-better angels, those green-on-blue incidents. What would be the best method for maintaining an effective counterinsurgency strategy in Afghan provinces and maybe stabilizing the Afghan government while also reducing the number of American casualties at the hands of their Afghan colleagues, those green-on-blue killings that we've seen recently?
This has been very disheartening, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I think Chad Gibbs and OIS Center also had pretty much the same question. We call it an insider threat, and also termed as green on blue. This goes back to my point about defining the problem. It's also green on green. More Afghan boys have died at the hands of this sort of thing, where one of their own friends or one of their own comrades in arms turns their weapon on them. First of all, understand the environment they're in. Doesn't mean you have to like it. This is a society that was turned upside down 30 years ago with the Soviet invasion. Numerous children were orphaned. Many of the boys were brought into madrasas, schools, where they were given a very stunted education, a very propagandized education. It's a society of what we call the Kalashnikov culture. You don't like somebody? There's automatic weapon everywhere, pick it up and go settle the score. So when you look at this and you recognize treachery has always been part of warfare throughout history, you have to look at what we did and see how we may have contributed. Two things. One, we stood up an army of 352,000 soldiers in the midst of a very difficult war against a very tough enemy. And just to put it in context, that would be like standing up a force double the size of the entire U.S. Marine Corps in a half dozen years and doing it with very little time to train them before you put them right into the fight. And by the way, more Afghan boys die every week fighting for their country than all of NATO combined. So they also go under all the stresses of combat that you have probably become associated with in terms of news reports and that sort of thing. So what are we doing about this? Okay, we defined the problem, so what? First of all, there are now counterintelligence officers in each unit, and they do things like watching for how some of the young men are going. If they're going home and they're going to Pakistan when they go home, then they're called in and say, who are you seeing there? If we notice on their cell phones they're calling certain people, and we know who the enemy is, it doesn't surprise me, we read their mail, then we call them in and say, you're being discharged, you're not what we want here. In other words, we're putting in more screening now that we've stood this large army up in the midst of this fight. We've also got biometric data, where if we picked up a fingerprint off a bomb down in Kandahar one time in IED, and that fingerprint shows up on a new recruit in Kabul, we can now say, why don't you come over here and explain to us what you've done in your past. We also have changed our tactics. There's something called the Guardian Angel. The Guardian Angel is an armed U.S. soldier, sailor, Marine, and they're standing watch over their buddies as they work training the Afghan army. As they're out on patrol, there's always one behind the last American watching over them. And the Guardian Angel tactic is simply a pragmatic expectation that treachery exists in war. But what we won't do is we're not going to pull back. We're not going to say, well, they'll all sleep over in that compound, we'll sleep over here. Generally, what we say is you got to get even closer to it. And I would just tell you that this doesn't diminish our commitment one bit to what we're doing over there. We are going to continue to work with the Afghan forces. And remember, for every one of these that happened, there were 10,000 patrols that day of Afghan boys and Americans, or British troops, or Georgian, or Australian, or Norwegian, all working together, 50 nations working together. So while this will be the one thing that makes the news that night, it does not represent or define what's going on. And I would just tell you personally, I'm one of those who has slept quite well guarded by Afghan boys, only Afghan boys around me back in 2001 when we first went in. So you take each person in the world one at a time. You don't draw big conclusions about races and that sort of thing, because this society has been through very, very difficult times, traumatic times beyond my ability to articulate.
So I know that counterinsurgency is one of your areas of expertise, and I'm going to push on with that part of that question a little bit. This is from Kirby Lawrence, who's in economics, and he's looking at the big picture. The process of removing insurgent groups in the Middle East or Afghanistan, and perhaps particularly in Afghanistan, could be compared to cutting a head off from the Hydra. One is removed, another one springs up. What are effective ways to try to stop that springing up? Do we need to turn to other modes of bringing about stability and peace? Are there things that are effective militarily for preventing those movements from springing up?
On the kind of movements that are going on out there right now, these go back about 100 years. Now, some people say they go back even further. You've got the Sunni terrorist side, you know it as Al-Qaeda and associated movements. Coming out of the Golden School or the Shia side, you've heard of them as Lebanese Hezbollah and associated movements like that, all supported by Iran. So there's, first of all, you have two very different groups. They like to kill each other, by the way, so it's not like they've killed more Muslims than they've killed Jews, Christians, Hindus combined. So this is a problem that my Muslim friends, frankly, have scared to death. As far as the military's role, we can best be used by showing other militaries, other police, how they do ethical policing, how they build consensual policing where the society wants them there and helps keep these terrorist types out. But in the long run, people who carry guns and wear uniforms can only buy time until a society cleanses itself of this. How do you do it? Have a political process that allows people with different views to bring their views forward and be considered. First of all, just make sure there is a way to bring up ideas that doesn't force people to go out and pick up a gun to get their idea listened to. That doesn't help for all. I have fought people, and they don't care one bit about their political views. They're not religious. Believe me, I've sat there and had them tell me, we're going to come to America, we're going to kill all the Americans and Jews, and then we're going to rape all your wives and daughters. I'm not tormented by fighting people like that. I've unfortunately been quoted in the press via press here, so I won't say anything tonight to get quoted again. But the bottom line is, for those kind of people, we buy time. What do we buy time for? Governance, education, and economics. To remove the environment where that gets higher than what the police can handle. There's always criminals, unfortunately, it seems like in every society. We just buy time so those other things can keep from making it a hydra, as you put it, and just make sure that you have an environment where we're not chopping off one head and going to 10 more. And frankly, we know what we're doing on this, but again, we're not in control of all over the countries. So they've also got to help themselves in this regard. Governance, economics, and primarily, I think, in the long run, it's education.
Okay, this is a question about the significance of understanding culture and religion. And throughout your talk, I picked up that you've learned quite a lot about this along the way. You noted how your own education expanded, your need for it expanded when you were in Cambodia. So this is a question from Paul Fletcher and Anthony Napoli, both of them professors in religious studies. To what extent do U.S. armed forces need to understand other religions and cultures, in the Middle East, particularly Islam, understand cultural differences? Have you seen a growth in this kind of knowledge of other cultures, other religions, among our representatives, among our military forces, and to what extent does that make a difference?
Well, the only way you can really make common cause and create the harmony we're looking for when we work against enemies in these other countries is you've got to have a way to bridge the gap between you and those people. And obviously, being able to speak the language, being able to understand the culture, these are critical skills. I would go so far to say that we have probably not made a single technological mistake, purely technological military mistake, in the last 11 years of war. At the same time, we have made hundreds of cultural mistakes. And frankly, ladies and gentlemen, in many, many cases, we've had to learn the hard way, how do you make the common cause necessary. It can be something as minor as if you can't speak the language and you're in a village, and that's going to happen sometimes. There are sometimes dialects and very few people speak well enough to, even our interpreters have trouble speaking with the folks here. First thing you do, you take your sunglasses off so you see your eyes. Believe it or not, a lot of people, no matter what culture you're from, you can convey fear, you can convey anger, you can convey kindness just by looking someone else in the eye. You know it. Every one of you know it. Yet just to tell our truth, we wear those sunglasses, by the way, because in the event of a blast, it'll protect our eyesight. You have to tell them when you're talking to someone, take the sunglasses off. We need cultural skills, and we do a fairly good job, I think, as we prepare troops going overseas. We have Americans who are from Afghanistan or Pashtun or our Tajik, and they actually work at our training bases, and we'll actually put the troops through drills where they'll go into a village and Afghan Americans are sitting there acting just like they would in their own villages. And so these are critical skills. I'd go so far as to say they're just as important as your skills with a rifle or your skills with a radio. These are the same kind of things that you need for your military, purely military tasks. You need, and you try to make common cause.
Thanks. Okay, this one comes from a veteran, Dr. Elisa Sikoloff, who's a doctoral student in veterinary sciences. And she starts at the specific and moves to the really broad. She says, as an airman who served during the war in Iraq in 2003, I remember hauling around my MOPP gear. And maybe you'll help those of us who aren't so familiar with the lingo. Do you believe biological warfare is currently a significant threat for U.S. troops in the Middle East or Afghanistan? And what about in the near future? To what extent are biological threats something we need to be worried about?
First, thanks for your service during those very uncertain times. The MOPP gear, MOPP gear, mission-oriented protective posture. That's a fancy way of saying, ladies and gentlemen, that we were wearing charcoal-impregnated suits. We had booties we could put on over our regular boots. Your body temperature go up to about 195 degrees, it would feel like. And then you'd snap on some rubber gloves when the gas alarm went off, and we'd pull on our gas mask. You generally did not wear the gas mask except when the alarm went off. And I bring this up because a lot of people looked actually, oh, they didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. Well, here were the people that thought they did have weapons of mass destruction. The UN inspection teams, Canada, Israel, Kuwait, Germany, I can go on, United States. And for those of you who went in there not knowing if even the air you breathed was going to be poisoned, I have the deepest respect. On biologicals, I can't go into a lot of specifics. I'll just put it this way. You would expect that those of us in the military also act as your sentinels for America. We have got some very, very capable men and women who watch this every day. They watch for it. It is a very high priority intelligence requirement, and just rest assured that even though surprise will always be our companion in this world, that is something that we do not take for granted that wouldn't be coming our way. But at the same time, so far it's not been used, at least not in what I would call a significant way, and we do not see it right now in the region. But I have no, I'm paid to take a very dim view of human nature, so we keep our eye on it.
You talked quite a lot about various ways for helping unstable governments become more stable and so forth. And you talked about the importance of enhancing people's everyday, ordinary lives and making those better so that they would be perhaps less inclined to turn toward radical solutions. Jasper Fitzgerald from Agricultural Communications and Brian Mueller, who's an assistant professor in plant sciences, both proposed questions along this line. Afghanistan is one of the most food insecure places in the world, and it also has water supply issues. What is the U.S. doing in Afghanistan to work with Afghans on those critical, ordinary, everyday life issues? Food insecurity, adequate supplies, clean water.
Yeah, it's an interesting country. For those of you who have gray hair like me, you'll remember that Afghanistan, believe it or not, was on the hippie train. It was a place you went to because the people took you in. They're kind people. They still are, by the way. Those who haven't been radicalized or traumatized. And it was a place where pomegranates grew for as far as you could see. My deputy commander is a Navy SEAL, Vice Admiral Bob Harwood, graduate of Tehran American High School. And he once hitchhiked from Tehran all the way across Iran, all the way around Afghanistan, got ill there, was taken care of by Afghan doctors, and hitchhiked on to New Delhi. And all he remembers was the fields, as far as he could see, of fruit and vegetables, this sort of thing. Soviets came in many cases they cut the orchards down, because the insurgents did in the orchards, destroyed many of the irrigation, very, very old irrigation systems there, and the road network crumbled basically under the Soviet occupation. So much of the problem that we have today is not that they can't grow enough food, it's how do they transport it before it rots in the very high heat at harvest time. So part of what we're doing has to do, and the Asian Investment Bank, World Bank, IMF are helping to pave roads so that the farmers just get their goods to market in time. On water, there are some great big dams over in Afghanistan, believe it or not. Some of them built by USAID as far back as the 1950s. And there we've got some challenges with how you get these old irrigation systems to work and make certain we're irrigating the right kind of terrain, something that you all understand out here. So I believe that Afghanistan, with a good transportation network and modest improvements on irrigation, will be able to feed itself. Right now, it is trying to get back to being a food exporter, which it once was. And so they have got much more grand ideas about where they can go with this than perhaps their current situation or their situation since the Soviets came would indicate.
If I could follow up on that, this is my own little question. Over the past 10 years, there have been debates within the military and the foreign policy establishment as well about poppy and opium. And for a while, part of the strategy was eradication, and for a while it was payoff. And I haven't actually read anything on that recently, and I wonder if either that has declined on its own, or if there is a more effective strategy, or if we've stopped worrying about it.
I don't think we can ever stop worrying about it. I think Russia's got a worsening heroin addiction problem. Tehran, I believe, has over 1 million heroin addicts. Even with countries that we don't necessarily see eye to eye on everything, there may be opportunities here to work together, frankly. So I would never take my eye off this, but I think even in our own society, we've just seen so many wonderful young lives just shoveled into the waste bin of life because they got tied up with this kind of junk. The poppy crop this last year was horrible, but it wasn't due to our actions, it was natural. And so once in a while, the good Lord steps in and helps us. But what we are doing, ladies and gentlemen, is the drug kingpins. We're not trying to go out and declare war on every small farmer. It would alienate us. We would simply, again, force people more over probably to the enemy's side. But what we can do is go after the drug labs, the shipments, the big guys, and we go after them the same way we go after the Taliban. For one thing, the Taliban gets much of their funding from the poppy market. So it's an ongoing effort. The Afghan government has active eradication programs going on, which is the right way for it to be done by the Afghans, not by the foreign forces. But we support them a lot. And there's a lot of effort that goes into it, but there's also crop substitution that's going on. And in many cases, because of the climate, the poppy is actually the more robust crop, so that it's not easy. I don't want to say this is something where we'll just go and get them all to grow apples and presto, the poppies will go away. It's a very complex problem, and we try to work it as intelligently as we can while supporting the international and certainly an Afghan government effort to eradicate.
So here's perhaps the broadest question of the day. This is from Sarah Legg, who's in agroecology, who says, hypothetically speaking, what would happen to the Middle East, to U.S. and Middle East relations, to tensions there and so forth, if there were no longer any demand for oil?
Interesting, because as you know, probably better than most states in the Union, we're probably approaching the time when by 2020 or so, the North American continent will be pretty much perhaps energy independent. I'm not an expert on it, but I talk to people who are. And this is a fundamental change in our own situation. But that said, ladies and gentlemen, the price at the pump, because of the globally traded oil, is probably going to continue to be set by the oil coming out of the Middle East. China, India, countries with rising economies, rising demand. We deal with them. Our trade is tied up with them. I don't think you can say that because we are going to gain a certain degree of energy independence that we can then turn our back on the problems of the Middle East. That said, certainly it would allow us, I think, to go for a more international way to police the waterways and try to get more of our burden carried by the American taxpayer, the American military, shifted to a more international organization. But let me just point out one thing. I told you that I support Secretary Clinton's foreign policy, but she sets foreign policy for the United States and the President's direction for it. And just last 2 weeks ago, we had 35 nations show up on an exercise that we, the United States, ran. 35 nations from 6 continents. Were I able to get a penguin from Antarctica, I would have had every continent represented. And they were out there for one thing, to do mind-sweeping exercises. Now, that's a completely defensive exercise. It has nothing to do with offense. And these nations all rallied around when we put the word out 6 months ago we were going to do this. And countries like Japan and Brazil, countries like Australia and Norway, Estonia, Djibouti, you can see what I'm driving at here. United Arab Emirates, they all came together, and as Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of UAE, put it, the entire world depends on Middle East oil. So it's properly an international responsibility to keep the peace and the waterways open. So even if we're not as reliant on the oil, if we want to sell our wheat or our beef overseas, those countries are going to have an economy that permits them to buy it. We are interconnected in this world, whether we like it or not. And it should certainly lower, in some ways, the cost on us to help do our part of the job. I don't think it would allow us to completely turn our back on it.
Okay. I'm going to push you. This is my own question. This is about Syria, a place that I understand perhaps you've been close to recently. The struggle between the Syrian government and the Syrian rebels is having a regional impact, causing internal political problems in Lebanon, sending Syrian refugees over the border to Jordan, and of course, this week, Syrian forces targeted a border village in Turkey. What does CENTCOM focus on when they're evaluating the situation? Are you focused on the rebels, on containing conflict, on strategizing for in case the Assad regime falls? How do you deal with such a complex situation? How do you even begin to think about it?
All the above. But the first thing you do is you try to define what the problem is, and in that regard, you look at what is the end state we want. Well, I mean, let me just draw some thoughts out here. First of all, we'd like the killing to stop. That'd be a nice start. The savagery goes beyond my ability to explain it. Just understand this. Assad is using every weapon system he has on his own people, people who initially were just demonstrating peacefully. He has turned every weapon system he has, with the exception of chemical weapons, on his own people. Where his own army has been beaten out of areas, he's now deciding to bomb those areas from the air if he can't hold them. So part of this is just stop the brutality. Again, Russia's regrettable veto removed from the international community the legal construct within which they could have perhaps moved to do that. Then couple that with Iran's full-throated support with weapons, technical advisors. They've sent in a very, very capable brigadier general who has proved himself murderously effective against the Greens in his own country. A man, I wouldn't call him a gentleman, named Hamadani. And they are doing everything they can to keep Assad in power, because if Assad goes, that'll be the biggest strategic setback for Iran in 25 years, and Lebanese Hezbollah will be exposed politically in Lebanon, and now the further isolation of Iran as it moves towards nuclear armament becomes even more pronounced, what our country has been doing for years here, along with the European Union and the United Nations. So we look at this as all connected, and you have to break it down into its parts. And certainly we need to reinforce those countries with humanitarian supplies in Turkey and in Jordan to take care of these people. The winter is coming. It'll be bitterly cold up there along the Jordanian border, a country that already, because of the Palestinian problem, has got millions of refugees living in it. They can't keep doing this. It's a poor country. They just can't keep taking them in. So you take each one of these, you break it out, you work with the friends we have in the region, and we have a lot of friends in the region, and you just try to contain the problem, and meanwhile you try to buy the time, from my perspective, that the diplomats can hopefully solve the problem. But I cannot give you a lot of optimism in the near term on this.
The most interesting move to me that the Turks made was the vote to authorize military responses, and that seems to me to have different implications than for us, because Turkey is a NATO ally.
Well, certainly NATO condemned the killing of the villagers here that just happened. It was just stupid by the Syrians to do that, to fire into another country. But they've also fired into Lebanon. They have also killed people refugees trying to get into Jordan. This is a regime that is distressing in every way. And when you look it up in Turkey, what is going on, I don't think that was meant as a call to arms and a reason for war, but it shows the seriousness of this situation as the violence spills over. I think we're going to get the hook here. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for having me here. It's really a pleasure. And if that airplane leaves tonight, minus one person, you see a guy with a green uniform up in the snowy rain, you know what's going on.